And so our hearts have to be engaged in worship to God. And we see in passages like this that our hearts have to submit to what God says. Now, God told the Israelites also to help you remember that you need to serve me and love me with all of your heart. I want you to put tassels on the bottom of your garments. Look at what the law of Moses says in Numbers chapter 15, verses 39 and 40. The law of Moses says it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember, notice, all the commandments of the Lord, so as to do them and not follow after your own heart and after your minds, after which you played the harlot, so that you remember to do all the commandments and be, notice our lesson from last week, holy to the Lord your God. Look at these tassels and allow these tassels to remind you that you've got to keep the commandments of the Lord with all of your heart. Don't follow after your heart. Follow after my commandments with your heart. Do what I say do. Follow my commandments. Now, the book of Psalms has a number of references to the importance of the law of God and having it in our heart. Psalm 37, verse 31, the psalmist says, the law of his God is in his heart, and his steps do not slip. Psalms 51 and verse 17, the sacrifices of the Lord are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. Serving God with all of our heart. And it takes a conscious effort on our part to obey God from our heart. Psalms 119 is full of verses like verse 112. I have inclined my heart, and I have sought you. Do not wander from your commandments. Serving God from the heart. Now, that service to God from the heart means that we submit to what God says, and we don't do differently from what God says. Once again, look at Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 2. And then we're going to look at verse 9. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 2 in this book that is emphasizing having the heart engaged in obeying God. And in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 2, God says, you shall not add to the word which I am commanding you, nor take away from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you. Now look down at verse 9. Only give heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently, so that you do not forget the things which your eyes have seen, and they do not depart from your heart all the days of your life, but make them known to your sons and your grandsons. So God is saying, do what I say, nothing more and nothing less. Don't add to it, don't take away from it, just keep my commandments. Just do what I say. Now, the Old Testament has a number of examples of those individuals who did not take God seriously. We looked at this one example from last week. Here's this illustration. We go to the government office. We go to some other public place like a hospital, and we see this sign on the door that says, Access Authorized Personnel Only. Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 2 is that sign that God has put in His Word, and there's a number of them just like it. Proverbs chapter 30 verses 5 and 6, 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 2, Galatians chapter 1 verses 6 through 9, 2 John verses 9 through 11, Revelation chapter 22 verse 18. There's lots of these signs in God's Word that says access authorized personnel only. What is that? What do I mean by that? We don't have to have a sign on that door at the post office, for example, that has everybody's name listed who can't go in the office. That sign could not be long enough to put up there everybody who's not authorized to enter. But all of us have enough common sense to know I don't work there. Sometimes even if you do work there, you're not authorized to go into certain areas. But you know if you're authorized to go in there. Well, the Bible cannot be thick enough to hold all of man's imaginations that he could come up with, where God says, okay, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. It couldn't contain all of the do nots. So what God has done is He says, here's what I want you to do. Now don't add to it. And that's enough. Access authorized personnel only. So, look at some of these examples from the Old Testament. And we talked about Nadab and Abihu last week, how they offered strange fire before the Lord, fire which He has not commanded. God showed His disapproval by sending fire from heaven and consuming those men, because they offered something that was not authorized. We look at the example of Moses in Numbers chapter 20, when the Israelites were complaining about being thirsty. Now, 40 years before at Rephidim, God had told Moses under the same situation, He said, I want you to strike the rock. And Moses struck the rock with his rod, and out came water. This time, 40 years later, God changed His command. Moses did not change his response. In Numbers chapter 20 at Kadesh Barnea, the Israelites are again complaining about not having any water, being thirsty, and God tells Moses, Moses, I want you to speak to the rock. But instead, Moses struck the rock. And God said, Moses, why did you not believe me? You see, there is an intimate relationship between faith and obedience. Moses, why didn't you believe me? Believe what? Believe that you couldn't bring water out of the rock? No, that wasn't the problem. The problem was Moses did not believe that when God says, I want you to speak to the rock, Moses didn't think he had to do that. He thought, well, 40 years ago, He told me to strike the rock. I struck the rock, out came water. This time I'm going to strike the rock again. God said, no, that's not authorized. And Moses ended up losing his position in the promised land that he had waited 120 years for, because he did something that was not authorized. How about Saul, in 1 Samuel chapter 15? Saul, I want you to go kill all the Amalekites. Saul said, well, I'm going to leave the king alive, and all of the best animals I'm going to leave alive. Well, that's not what God said, but that's what Saul thought. And so when Samuel the prophet comes along, he says, Saul, why did you leave all these animals alive? Saul said, well, I'm going to offer them as a sacrifice. That's a good thing, isn't it? Sacrifices were required by God in the law of Moses. Offering sacrifice is a good thing, isn't it? So Saul said, I'm going to offer these as a sacrifice. Samuel said, no, it's not right. God didn't authorize you to offer those animals as a sacrifice. In verses 22 and 23, Samuel says, to obey God is more important than to worship. To obey God is more important than to worship. And so God took the kingdom out of Saul's hand, and Saul wound up losing his life, and God gave the kingdom to David. David himself did not always do things that were right. 1 Chronicles chapter 15. David built a temple in Jerusalem so that they could bring the Ark of the Covenant there, and they could worship God at the Ark of the Covenant. But David did not seek the law of God to see how they needed to transport that Ark. And so the Israelites put the Ark on a cart, and they were dragging it by 2 oxen. The cart stumbled, the Ark started to fall over. Uzzah put his hand up to steady it in all sincerity and all good intentions, but David was disobeying God, and God took Uzzah's life. David realized that some 6 months later, God says, the reason why God did that is because I was not seeking the law of God. I was doing something that wasn't authorized. And then one last example. King Uzziah. King Uzziah in 2 Chronicles chapter 26. King Uzziah was from the family of David, which was from the tribe of Judah. King Uzziah got prideful, the Bible says, and he decided, I'm going to come into the tabernacle, or temple rather, and I'm going to offer sacrifices to God. But King Uzziah wasn't authorized by God to offer sacrifices because he wasn't from the tribe of Levi. He was from the tribe of Judah. Now, the priests, some 80 of them came in and tried to stop Uzziah from disobeying God, but he was king, and the kings can do what they want to. And so he started to offer sacrifices anyway, so the God of heaven struck Uzziah with leprosy. See, Uzziah was trying to do something that God didn't give him authority to do. Look at the reasoning that the prophet Jeremiah uses in Jeremiah chapter 32 about the idolatry that the Israelites were engaging in. And notice God's reasoning. They built the high places of Baal that are in the valley of Ben Hinnom to cause their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire to Molech, which, notice God says, I have not commanded them, nor had it entered my mind that they should do this abomination to cause Judah to sin. I didn't command it. It never entered my mind. How would the Israelites know it entered God's mind? Because it would be written if it had. What I've commanded and what I've written. Now let's apply this principle to the New Testament today and to our worship on this side of Calvary. One of the things that people notice most immediately when they worship with the churches of Christ is that we do not use mechanical instruments of music in our worship. Now we're going to get to this point in just a moment, but no religion used instruments for about 600 years. And then when the Protestant churches separated from the Catholic churches, they didn't use instruments for several hundred years either. What does the New Testament say? Among a varied number of verses that deal with our worship in the New Testament times, there are these. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 15, the Apostle Paul says, I will pray with the Spirit, and I will pray with the understanding also. I will sing with the Spirit, and I will sing with the understanding also. Notice what Paul is saying. He's saying, I'm going to engage my mind in worship, and I'm going to engage my heart when I sing and when I pray. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19. Ephesians chapter 5 is a series of verses that has to do with living the Christian life. And in verse 18, the Apostle Paul says, be filled with the Spirit. Well, how are we filled with the Spirit? Paul goes on to tell us in verse 19, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody where? In your heart. Remember the emphasis on the heart back in the Old Testament? God says, I want you to worship in the heart. I want you to sing and I want you to make melody in your heart. Because the heart is the origin of all of our actions. The heart is what motivates the worship. The heart is what provides the determination and the direction and the intentions that we have in our lives. And God says, I want you to sing and make melody in your heart. And then the verse that we had read just a moment ago, Colossians 3 and verse 16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. Now there's a number of other references in the New Testament, of course, to singing or to our musical aspect of our worship. But let's talk about that point about the use of mechanical instruments in worship. It is true, first of all, that instruments were used by the Jews. The Old Testament is replete with examples of David primarily using instruments in his worship. Instruments were used in Jewish worship up to the time of the New Testament and past the New Testament. But when the Jewish synagogues were composed of people who became Christians, guess what the Christians did with those musical instruments? They kicked them out. It is true that instruments were used by pagans during the time of the New Testament church. But when the pagans became Christians, guess what they did with the instruments? They kicked them out. And so there is no evidence in the New Testament that the church under the guidance of the apostles and inspired prophets, no evidence that that church, the Church of Jesus Christ in the first century, no evidence that it used mechanical instruments of music in its worship. The church that came along in the second generation, they did not use instruments in their worship. The church that came along in the third generation, they did not use instruments in their worship. The church that came along in the fourth generation of Christians, they did not use mechanical instruments in their worship. The church that came along in the fifth generation, they did not use instruments in their worship. The church that came along in the sixth generation, they did not use instruments in their worship. So far as we can tell from historical records, it was not until the 7th century when churches began to use mechanical instruments in their worship. Now, it is also true that the word a cappella, which means singing without an instrument, literally means in the Latin, as the chapel. As they worship in the chapel, as they worship